Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is cartoonist Sandra Bell-Lundy. Sandra, welcome to Comic Culture.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
So let's talk about your strip, Between Friends. It's really interesting. It's, I guess, in the mold of a gag a day, but you also have a lot of serialized content. So I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about Between Friends.
Well, Between Friends there's three women who are longtime friends, so it's basically about the interaction and the day-to-day of their lives. And yeah, I do have individual gags, but I frequently write sequentially, usually on a Monday to Friday or a Monday to Saturday, and it's sort of a theme that I explore for the week.
And it's an interesting dynamic because it's these three friends, and as if I'm not mistaken, your characters actually age. The real passage of time is represented in their lives. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that decision to make things have actual impact in their lives.
It just sort of happens organically because I've always drawn cartoons as a hobby, even when I was a kid. And where the Between Friends strip came from actually was I had used to draw cartoons about my friends. Something happened with a boyfriend or at school or in job or something like that, and I would just lampoon them in some little gag. And so when I decided to put a strip together, those are the characters I took. I initially had 5, and then I took it down to 3 after getting some advice from the syndicates. So when I started, my characters were about in their mid-30s, which is where I was. And then gradually along the line, I had children, and their influence was hard to ignore, so I brought in children. And then I started, me and my friends, you get older, health issues, you use glasses to read, just little things. And so that was just reflected in what in what I would see every day.
Now, you mentioned the syndicate giving you feedback and helping develop the strip a little bit. So I'm wondering, when you're pitching a strip to a syndicate, what sort of steps do you have to go through? And when you hear that feedback, how do you react? Because I know for me, if I get feedback on something that's really close to my heart, I might take it the wrong way.
Well, not from the syndicate. Before King picked me up, I had initially been taking my strips to the local newspaper, the managing editor, Murray Thompson, and I would go, from time to time over, period actually of 4 years, and I would put it away because things would get up, and I remember one of the times I was talking to him, and he says, "Oh, one of these characters is." I passed it around the newsroom, and everyone thought that she was too dumb, like it was, and it was not. And I said, "Well, okay, I'll change her." And he said, no, he said, "You have to be true to yourself." So I had to go home and think about that, and it was kind of difficult because I knew I had to change it, but I knew I had to keep it the same. So there was that fine line of working my voice, but making it, improving it, I guess is the word. And then when I started working with Jay Kennedy, my syndicate during my development period, I would send in my strips and he would tell me what works and what didn't. And you just gradually sort of, it's kind of an odd thing. It's difficult to explain it, but you have to keep your own voice. But if you're not willing to listen to critique, especially from a professional, then you're probably in the wrong business.
And you have the 3 lead characters, and I know that you've done some recent stories that have been one character is sort of always going back and forth with her ex-husband. Another character is struggling at work to sort of stand up for herself. And I'm wondering, when you're working on the storylines, is this something that you have a goal in mind? Like I want to make a point about something, or is it just something, like you said, that happens organically, where it's just, what's going on this week with Kimberly?
No, when I start for the week, I never know where things are going to go. They just, I have my book, my coffee, I sit down, and once I hit on something that I want to, I don't know, that's just in my brain, and I'll just brainstorm and I'll write down as many ideas as I can think of, and then I'll go back and I'll take things that sort of make sense in terms of a little story. So, but where it goes, it's just I'm brainstorming on, one idea on top of another.
You're working on a strip a day, essentially. So I'm wondering, how much time does it actually take you between the writing and, the layouts and the final inks for you to do a daily strip?
Everything depends on the writing. Everything. I could draw an ink a week in a long day, but I don't really like to do it because I like to take a little bit more time with the art. I can I can time the artwork, but I can't time. I find it difficult to time the writing. So it all depends. And then I couldn't really. It's tough to get the computer work in on the same day, like with the Photoshop. So in a perfect world, I could write one day, draw one day, and ink one day. That would be perfect, but that never happens.
And on the Sunday strips, you're obviously doing anywhere between, I guess, 8 and 6 panels, depending on, I guess, the newspaper that's publishing them. So when you're working on the Sunday strip, is there more attention given to the thought of, like, I know the daily comics are often printed in color, but being the Sunday traditional, that's the one that we have more time to sit down. Is there more time, given to how that color palette might affect the story, or is it something where it's just done?
There's only been a couple of times where the color is affects the story. I've had to figure, and there's a few. I don't color my dailies, but I do color my Sundays. So if there's something in the dailies where the color is important, or if I mention when I send them in to my syndicate, I make a little notation and say, like, please note on this day, the wine is red or whatever, if it's important to the gag. No, you know what? I'm not very good with color. I never have been. For some reason, because I like to draw comics, everybody in my family thinks that I'm good with color, but I'm not. But yeah, so I forget what you asked me, but there you go.
Well, it's funny. I'm a hobby cartoonist, and I will side with you. I am terrible with color, but I can do a black and white drawing that I like. So I'm wondering, when you're working on your art and sending it out, do you prefer the old school approach where it's Monday through Saturday is black and white, or do you not even have an opinion on whether or not the daily should be in color?
I don't mind that the dailies are in color, but when I am inking the dailies, I've come to be aware that they're going to be colored, because that I think more papers than not have them in color. That's just a guess on mine, but I'm pretty. And for example, if I had a wine, they would have a glass of wine. If I wanted it to be red wine, I would color the wine in black. But because I know that they're going to color it, I will leave it clear, and then they'll color it in red. But then I personally send in 2 files. I send in my black and whites, I send in a file that is unscreened, and then I send in a file that is screened, because, like, Kim is African-American character, and I was finding I would put in the screen and all the little dots, and then they would color it on top of the dots, and it looked terrible. So I started sending in 2 files. But yeah, there's different. If it's just black and white, you are more aware of the contrast. So it's something to keep in mind, and it's easier to have, I think, just the black and white, but I guess the color jazzes it up sometimes.
And when you say screen, I'm thinking of that dot scale that we would sometimes see.
Yeah.
Is that something that you do on the computer, or is that something that you apply with a brush or something?
Well, a long time ago, I used to use electrotone and cut it out with my X-Acto knife when my fingers would be cramping. But now I do use Photoshop for that.
Something that I always find interesting is when we talk about art, everyone is kind of combining the traditional and the new tools of Photoshop or Manga Studio or something like that. And I'm just wondering what you're doing. It looks to me, when I look at your work, that you're maybe inking with a brush, and I could be wrong, you could just be really good with a pen. So I'm wondering what you're using and how you go about that.
I have my tools here for you.
Oh, great.
I do all of my lettering in, first I do everything in pencil. And then, can you see these microns? I will use these for lettering. And then I like to use a Pentel brush, which I can keep refilling, and this Pentel brush has lasted me for about 15 years. It's a really good product. So I will use the Pentel brush and do all the main lines, and then I'll frame it with my micron, and then I will fill it in, and I'll show you, this is what a daily strip looks like, if you can see. So it's about, I don't know, 4 by 12. And then, but notice there's no blacks in there. I fill that in Photoshop. So that's where. But I have a Sunday here, and I have filled in the blacks. I probably wanted to show this to somebody, but just to show you.
That's amazing.
Yeah. When you put in the blacks, that's what I mean about the contrast. I mean, it really, it makes things jump out. So those are the things that you're thinking about with the black and white.
When you're thinking about laying out a page, I know in comic books, a number of the artists that I've spoken to talk about how they use black to sort of guide the eye into a specific area where they want the reader to go. And I'm wondering, when you're doing your art, if you're thinking along those same lines, and how working digitally to put those blacks in, how that impacts you as you're sitting at the drawing board.
Now here's a daily, and notice that's only 2 frames. And so when I'm drawing that, I'm not really thinking about the blacks or anything, but by the time I get into Photoshop, then I'm looking at it on the screen and I'm saying, okay, I got to put the black in here to make it pop, or maybe I need some screening because it's too dull. And I sort of decide that when I'm actually gotten to that final stage. But when I'm actually doing the inking on my drawing board, I don't really think about that. That's just me.
And are you the type of person, some artists like to play music, some people have the TV on, some people want, just the birds in the background. So I'm wondering, in your workspace, is it music, is it TV, is it silence?
It's silence.
Really?
It's silent, yeah. Well, that's not totally true. It's silence until I'm photoshopping, and then I hunt for a podcast, and then I listen to podcasts while I'm photoshopping. But when I'm writing, for sure, it's silence. And when I'm drawing, I don't like to have music or anything because it distracts my thinking, because I edit as I go along. And then I have to read because it determines how, the body posture, is that right? How the body, and the facial expressions. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about that. So it's like a reading process, even though I'm drawing. So I don't like to hear anything then. But when I'm photoshopping, it's just all visual. It's not thinking. It's thinking, but you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I guess when you're working on the storytelling, I guess you're kind of talking about the acting, the individual characters. I'm wondering, when you're sitting down and you're looking at the 3 lead characters, let's say they're in a scene together, I'm imagining that you know how each of them looks and would react in a certain spot. And so I'm wondering, is that a conscious thing that when you're sitting down and putting the characters on the board, that you're thinking about, like, oh, so-and-so would sit this way and she'll sit that way, or is it just something that's natural at this point?
I think at this point it's a natural thing that I do because I've been doing it for so long. But the facial expressions and how the body is, it's definitely makes the difference to what the gag is. And a lot of times in my brainstorming book, I may just sketch, the eyes or a smile or something, because how they look, I mean, if they could be happy, if you draw her happy, or you could draw her mad or disgruntled, but how she looks, it could totally change the meaning of the gag. So the expressions and the body language, that's the word I was looking for, body language, is very important, and it makes a difference to the tone of what I'm trying to say. It makes a difference to the gag, and it also sets up how the other character is going to react.
And you talked about I guess the brainstorm book. Is this something that you keep with you wherever you go, just in case that moment of inspiration happens? Because again, 365 strips a year seems like a lot of ideas have to be generated. So is this something that you just travel with, and you might be out to dinner or something and just, let me write this down real quick?
No, because if I go, say I go to a cartooning conference, when I'm there, I want to be having fun with my friends. And I want to, sometimes you have to have some space from it. And then when you come back, it fuels you. Like it's like a burst of energy when you have that break from it. But there's the odd time that an idea will come up and I'll write it down, but not very often. Usually it's when I sit down to write, it's like, that's the writing time. I may have some newspapers with me, or I may have some, like I even brought, see, all these things I have for you. Well, you don't have to say it, but if I see something on the internet, like I'll print it out and I'll keep it for another time because it's an idea starter. But when it's writing time, it's writing time. I just don't think I could have my brainstorming book with me all the time, because sometimes you have to turn it off.
it seems like you have a pretty set schedule. I mean, you've been working on the strip for many years now, so I'm just wondering, what's the average day like? Is it, you get up at noon and get started, or is it like you're up at the crack of dawn and that's it, you're at the drawing board?
Well, no, I wish I was that organized. My day starts by reading the paper. Like I have coffee and a piece of toast, and I read the paper, and of course I read the comics, and then I go to work from there. And it depends on what day it is and what's happening. And I mean, if I have a bad writing day, like I say, writing is everything. It's my whole week is determined by how that writing goes. So I wouldn't, as much as I try to have a set schedule, and this is one of the things I talk about with my cartooning friends, and they say, well, why don't you, this day do that? And I say, believe me, I've thought of them all. It's just whether or not it actually happens. So I try to have a schedule, but I don't, because everything, wraps around how the writing went.
You talk about talking with other cartoonists, and what you do is different than, let's say, what a comic book artist would do, where a penciler is going to pass the pages off to the letterer, who will pass it off to the inker, and then the colorist, and then eventually it gets printed. You're doing everything yourself, and it seems like it's sort of a solitary existence. So when you are interacting with other cartoonists, is your experience similar to theirs, or is it something, everyone's unique and everyone has their own way?
I think everyone has their own way, and it depends too. I think if you're working with somebody, you have to, like I know my friend Rena Piccolo is now working with Hilary Price on Rhymes with Orange, and they have their very set days, because Rena has to do her writing, and then they collaborate, and then the artwork. So they have each days, because both of them, it's a back and forth. And I think everybody sort of has their own little style of how they do things.
And speaking of style, your art style, I think before we started, you described it as it's sort of a feminine approach to cartooning. And you said that you had a conversation with Lynn Johnson, who was one of my favorite cartoonists. She did the strip For Better or For Worse, which is one of those ones that I would read in the paper. That's how I fell in love with comics, was the daily newspaper. And you had an interesting story about how she gave you some advice when you were first getting started.
Yeah, I had sent some work to Lynn to critique, and she gave me a call. And she said, among other things, she says, well, the type of cartoon that you're doing, and it was in relation to the storyline. She said, well, like this strip, well, what happened next? It was the type of strip that, you wanted to, the next day your reader is going to want to know what happened next. And when she said the type of cartoon, I thought, what? There's types of cartoons, and it hadn't occurred to me. Now I totally get what she means by types of cartoons. Like there's the gag-a-day, there's a serial strip, there's a sequential strip, there's all different. But I just hadn't thought about it in those terms, and so that was interesting. Yeah, the feminine art style. That's what I would call my art style. I think it's feminine. I think because it's, I don't know why. I hate to say things like that these days. You have to be careful. But that's how I see my art style anyways. I feel that it is a feminine art style. From
what I've read, it was before I was able to view the strip, but you had a storyline about domestic abuse. And I'm wondering, obviously that's a very difficult subject to cover in what's essentially the lighter side of the newspaper. And I'm wondering what inspired you to do that story, and what sort of feedback you may have gotten, either positive or negative, from the readers.
Well, I have a particular friend who, when we were younger, she was actually in a domestic abuse situation, and at the time I had no idea. And we would part ways and come together depending on where we were in our life. And then later on in life, she started telling me about what had actually been going on at that particular time. And I was sort of, I was dumbfounded. I didn't know. And so the more I thought about it, I thought, that my strip, it features 3 women as the main characters, and it's a reality-based strip. So I thought it would be a good topic to explore. And I had asked her, would you mind if I formally interviewed you sometime, and I'd like to do the story about it, and which she agreed to. But I didn't want her story, but I just wanted to interview her to try to understand what she was thinking, like how she viewed things. And I did quite a bit of research on it, and I was a little nervous about writing it because it was a bit of a departure from the way I usually write. And because it's such a sensitive topic, you know, if I didn't get it right, if I didn't get it right, you know, people are going to get mad. And anyways, it turned out quite well. And I did it over a period of, I think, about 6 months. And I had by the end of the storyline, when it was all coming together, every day I would go down on my computer, and Terrence, you wouldn't believe it. I would turn on the computer in the morning, and it would just be click, 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 click. I would be getting so much email. And I heard from survivors and high school students and professors and clergy and police officers and, like, you name it. I had one father who had a daughter, and he said, you know, I hope that she's reading your strip in the paper because she's with a partner who blows up on her and has a gun and was waving it all around. And he just thought that by seeing this topic addressed in somewhere where you wouldn't normally see it, that it might make her think a little bit about leaving. He was so worried about her. I felt so bad. And so I had over 100 responses, and I was pleased. I was pleased that it went over so well. But by the end of it, boy, I was worn out from it. I had interviewed two shelters, and they were very helpful to me in determining how to approach the story and offering me advice. And because initially I didn't exactly know how I was going to approach the storyline, but at Jillian's place here where I live, a women's shelter, I was talking with the executive director and a counselor. And I asked them, how do women come to actually be at the shelter? Because I had to visually portray it, and I just didn't know. And she told me that the one thing that she heard the most often was that people would call her and say, I don't know if I'm calling or if I should be calling here. It's not like he hits me. And so then I decided I am not going to do it from physical abuse. I was going to do it from emotional abuse, which the counselor thought was a good idea because people they identify seeing the physical aspect because it's right there, but the emotional you don't, even though it's just as devastating. So, I mean, it was, that's it in a nutshell, but it was I was proud of how it turned out, but by the end of it, I was really worn out from writing it.
And it's interesting too, because we tend to think of the comic page as that lighter spot, and we don't necessarily think of the artist behind it doing important research to make sure that they present the information to their audiences correctly. So, I mean, it's just fascinating that you were thinking that deeply into the subject so that you could present it in a way that was true to so many people. So I'm wondering, as you are progressing as a cartoonist, as you're developing your storylines and whatnot, are there any other subjects that you've been thinking about, that need to be covered, or is it something where, again, it's going to be that item on the internet that you see one day, and that's going to be that story starter?
Yeah, it's I would like to try. I have a couple of ideas I would like to try for books. I did a personal graphic essay when my son was away at university, and then my daughter went and she moved 3 provinces away. She couldn't get far enough away. And so I was facing the empty nest. So I had done a series of personal graphic essays about that. So that was a little bit different. I'd like to try a book. I'm working on it now, but I'm trying to get through it. I'm trying to get to it, not through it. Maybe that's a Freudian slip. But no, as far as, but within between friends, it's if something strikes me, because you have to. I don't want to be cliche, and if I'm writing about something, I want it to be very organic, and I want to have some either insight or real interest in it. I wouldn't just choose something because it would be, that's the new hip, thing that should be there.
And again, it's interesting because you're talking about using cartooning in other forms to express other ideas, so that you were calling it was it a graphic essay? Was that what you were calling it? Or?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's just an interesting way to, I guess, approach something internal. So what is that like? Just wondering, how you write that compared to, let's say, the daily strip.
Well, something was interesting. I had written it, and I had sent it to the Toronto Star, and the managing editor had actually looked at it, and she said, "You've got too much here," and like in for the one page. And as soon as she said that, it's funny, a good editor. As soon as she said that, I knew what was wrong, but I needed somebody to tell me, and it ended up being 4 full pages, like on 4 consecutive Saturdays. The storyline appeared, and I think I forgot what you asked me. But I found that's what it was. I did find it a little difficult when I was writing it. Because when I was trying to break it down into the 4 pages, and what I had to do was, I think I'm so used to writing in the strip, newspaper comic strip format, that I had to write it like it was a full page, so I had to write, like, I think it probably took about 5 levels of strips, and I had to write it that way, and then I had to fix it so that was one storyline. I had to make adjustments just because that's just the most comfortable way for me to write. So that's how I ended up putting it together.
Well, Sandra, they're telling me that we have run out of time. I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with us, and I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon.